So here are some examples. So one functional alternative that might be common for you is to have a person go and take a cigarette break. So a lot of people who smoke already use this as a coping mechanism. The great thing in 2013 is that most of the time we have to go away from other people, go outdoors to have a cigarette, and that can be a really helpful aspect of this particular redirection. An incompatible alternative might be go wash your hands and face. If a person's been involved in something that they were involved with physical aggression or they smashed something, they may be dirty. They may need to go and change their clothes or wash their face. And it turns out that this is not only incompatible, but in many cases it will also be functional. When the person's more comfortable because they've cooled their face down, because they're clean again, that may actually help them to restore some of their calm. And of course it affords them a break from other people, which is also functional. Here's an example of we already talked about that is both. Go write down your side of the story in your own words while seated at a table away from whomever it is that you were in conflict with. And I would tell you that if you don't have pens and paper around you for individuals, then you are probably missing one of the simplest tools you can use. Now you may be saying to yourself, I work with people who are not going to be able to write. That's okay. Get them to draw. Get them to record what they're saying if that's a possibility where you are. Get them to talk to a partner about what's going on and ventilate it with that other individual. As we said, distractions not effective, and an example of that is telling a person just to go sit quietly while you talk with whomever the other party is. And one of the things I want to point out to you that's almost always a signal to me that something is not going to work is an abstraction like this. The word quietly is not a behavioral term. It's an adjective, in this case it's an adverb actually, but its adjectives and adverbs are not really concrete in describing to people what we want them to do, especially as they become more cognitively distorted, less cognitively capable. So as soon as you hear this ly in your expression, there's a pretty good chance that you're telling something to a person that's going to require more cognitive ability than you want. So another thing that you'll notice is when we're telling people to go and do the absence of behavior, it doesn't work. Go have a seat and don't talk. That's not very effective. Telling a person what they can do is a far more effective approach. Tell them what you want them to do instead. Go have a seat and instead of talking, write down your words or tell it to your iPhone's tape recorder. Something like that is a much more functional way, and it's going to engage the person. Now, some of you will work with individuals who receive medications on an as-needed basis. So the term for that is PRN medications, and that's simply a Latin expression or abbreviation for pro re nata, which simply means taken as needed. Now, PRN medications include everything from aspirin and Tums to medications taken for psychosis or for people who are in a state of agitation or anxiety. We're going to be talking in this slide particularly about the latter category, people who are experiencing a crisis as a result of mental health symptoms such as psychosis or increased anxiety or increased emotional agitation. A lot of times people are given medications by their doctors that they are supposed to take when they experience these symptoms. However, it is often very unclear what exactly is meant by when you experience these symptoms. At what point in the experiencing of these symptoms should I take the medicine? In a nutshell, it's often safest and most effective to offer a PRN at the stage 2. If you're giving it in stage 1, the person is going to learn to overuse that drug. They're going to become more likely to become dependent on it as a coping mechanism and therefore less likely to be able to cope without it. And if we give it in stage 3, the person may be too dangerous for us to approach, and their adrenaline level is going to be at a much higher level. So it's going to be like putting the brakes on a train when the train is at its maximum speed. Clearly, it's going to take a lot more to slow that train down than if you were to put the brakes on when the train was going at about a moderate speed. So the reasonable balance of this is to give that person the medication roughly at this middle ground. And I often find when I'm dealing with staff teams that they're very reluctant to give people their medications for this type of behavior. And I'm always curious about this. I think it has a lot to do with preconceptions that people have around medications, the belief that medications are bad for us. Well, we have to remember that when people engage in behavior that is aggressive or threatening to other people, that is not only damaging to other people, but also to them. It makes it harder for them to get access to the resources that they need. It often means that they're going to be engaged in the criminal justice system, which is stressful and cumbersome for them. And it often alienates them from other social contacts. So helping people to calm down using this medication can be a very functional life skill for that person. And rather than telling people that they can't have it, I think it's important for us to work on helping people to recognize the internal and external indicators that they need it and helping them to learn to use it in a balanced way. We don't want them to only rely on their medicine, but neither do we want them to be given a prescription that they can never actually utilize. So one of the indicators I look for is the person actually requesting the medicine. And when that happens, I try to make that as intrinsically reinforced as possible. In other words, I try to make sure that I make that a functional behavior for the person by giving them the medicine as promptly as I can. Remember that the medicine normally takes between 20 and 30 minutes to begin to have its therapeutic effect for most people, and that's if the medication is taken per oral, in other words, by mouth. If a medication is taken sublingually, which means under the tongue, it often has a far faster response time. However, for many of the people we'll be supporting, sublingual medications are challenging. Why? Because it's a very foreign experience to take something and hold it under your tongue for a few seconds or minutes, especially as you're agitated. Many people will automatically swallow the pill even though it's meant to be taken sublingually because they're starting to lose some of that cognitive capacity. So you have to really make a value judgment along with your consumer about what's going to work. If they swallow a sublingual pill, it doesn't mean that it won't be effective. It will still be effective. But we really want to try an approach that not only gives something to a person, but assesses its effectiveness. And we want to review that approach consistently involving the doctor and others who work with that person and the person, him or herself. Let's move on to stage 3, the crisis phase. Now remember, this is the stage where the person is at the highest level of their arousal. In fact, when I go in and I speak to staff teams and they tell me that a person's in their stage 3, a standard question for them is, have you ever seen this person behave in a way that was even more dramatic or dangerous than the behavior you're describing now? If they say yes, I know the person isn't in stage 3. Stage 3 is the peak of the mountain. So people can do some pretty dramatic things in stage 2. Stage 3 is when we know the person is really as far away as they're going to get from their normal selves, from their cognitive capacity. They're as irrational as they possibly can be. And that's why the interventions for us in stage 3 are really as much about what we don't do as what we do. And in fact, it's really important for us to make sure that we do not see ourselves as being in control here. We're not really going to help this person calm down as much as we're going to stop, and we're going to make sure that we stop things that might slow down their calming process. So the first of these is to reduce stimuli. And that stimuli is referred to in a general fashion. We're talking about all of the noises, all of the lights, all of the crowd activity, all of the banging and crashing that's going on around a person. So it might involve us having to withdraw people from that area. It's certainly going to involve things like turning off stereos, televisions, kitchen equipment, appliances, closing windows if there's traffic noise outside. It's certainly going to be about reducing the activity in the area around that person. And this can be a challenge, I recognize, but it is safer than the alternative. And we may have to move the audience, which can be a difficult thing in some circumstances. I've had some students, some classroom teachers tell me that they really don't want to do this. They don't want to move 24 or 27 people just so that they can have one individual be isolated. And what I point out to them is, as an educator myself, when there is an individual in a classroom who's becoming very agitated, that individual will be such a substantial distraction that it's a fairly safe bet that there's not a lot of learning going on in that environment in that time anyways. And the other thing we want to remember is that that group of students is likely going to be highly motivated to get far away. So if we can have that group of students be redirected to another activity, that's going to be very helpful. Can they go in the hallway? Can they go outside? Is there a multi-purpose area? And this isn't just true in schoolrooms. It might be that you're working in a community-based daytime program. It might even be in a standard, typical employment scenario where everybody decides this is where we're going to take our break. And this is why we want to have a plan in advance if we possibly can. Do we have a file that we can put aside as teachers for a spontaneous activity that we're going to do with a group of kids if we need to withdraw from that classroom? Do we have a standing procedure within our staff team that if we have this individual becoming agitated, we'll take our coffee break for 5 minutes and give them some space and time? One of the things that we did in one of the environments I was involved with was we created a room that was simply called the quiet room. Now, this room was used by everybody all the time for breaks and relaxation, but we simply had an understanding within our organization that if a person was becoming very agitated, we would allow them to use this quiet room and everybody else would leave. And because it was of mutual benefit, everybody followed the policy. The other thing that was interesting about this room, and I think I might have spoken about it in an earlier video, is that it had absolutely nothing locking the person in. There were no doors, there were no bars, there were no pads. It was simply a nice, comfortable area for a person to go and relax. And because of that, people chose to go there relax. And it was not stigmatized in any negative way whatsoever. So if you really do have difficulty getting people out of the area, an alternative is to find an area or create an area of refuge where people will want to go when they're this agitated. They have to have privacy, they have to have an ability to relax and perhaps recline, and maybe they have some of their favorite possessions in that area. One more thing that I want to speak about with regard to those favorite possessions. I've worked with individuals who were property destroyers when they became this agitated. And it might be surprising that one of the things that we did that reduced the amount of the property damage was that we put some of the person's favorite possessions in that space. They were less likely to damage the property because it was partly their property. And also they were more likely in some cases to actually use some of these possessions. For example, a really simple thing that we did was that we had in one area a big window. And we knew we wanted people to be able to have privacy. An individual had ripped curtains down from the windows when they had been agitated. So as an alternative, what we did is we put up some very nice picture of collages, including pictures of the individual that was agitated. And when that individual would go into that room, they would not rip the pictures down. In fact, after a few minutes of calming down, invariably, we'd find that person standing, looking almost nostalgically at these images that were on the wall, and it seemed to be an elemental way for that person to calm themselves down. Another simple thing for us to do is to create proximity. In other words, avoid proximity. We want to have proximity control. What that simply means is, as the police said, don't stand so close to me. So we want to really try to avoid as much as possible being in a person's personal space or even in their line of sight. Avoid physical contact for sure, eye contact as much as possible, and being close to the person. We want to use distance and, if possible, have barriers between us and that person. Things like, for example, standing on the opposite side of a piece of major furniture, a table or a sofa. Now, back to eye contact for a moment. As the intervener or the first responder in this circumstance, being aware of people's behavior so that you can keep them safe or keep others safe remains a concern, and we recognize that. But we don't need to look into people's eyes to see their behavior. We can look at their hands or we can watch them through our peripheral vision. And that sounds odd, and it takes some practice in my experience, but truly, I believe it's useful sometimes to look at the other people in a scenario or look at the surroundings and just keep a person in our peripheral vision. And remember what we said. It's easier usually to move the audience than it is to move the individual. The person will not respond well to any stimulation, including a simple request to move. People may move on their own accord, but as soon as you tell them to move or leave, there's likely going to be a negative response. And we want to observe that person covertly. We don't necessarily need to use our sight as a way of observing that person. And if we do use our sight, we might use it, as I said, peripherally or by looking around the corner at an individual. We might use something like a convex mirror, or even if we happen to be equipped this way, a video camera that's mounted in the facility. But we really, most of the time, just need our ears. And we can stand in a position where we know if the individual comes into our line of sight, they're moving towards other people, and therefore we would now have to intervene. So what I often do is simply get the audience or the potential group of victims separated from the potential aggressor and stand in a position where I'm not a threat to that aggressor, but I could intervene if the individual moves towards the others. As a rule, people in community-based settings are not not allowed to isolate the aggressor and lock him or her away. And I think that's a very good rule, because in order to move that person, we often have to physically restrain them or interact with them in a way that's dangerous for them and us. But we are allowed to withdraw ourselves and others to an area of refuge and essentially lock ourselves away. So if you're working in a setting where people become aggressive, don't create a locked area where you isolate the aggressor, but do create an area that people who would be potentially victimized can retreat and lock themselves in there. Make sure that it's a comfortable space that can accommodate everybody, and make sure that there's a way of communicating with the outside world there in case, for example, you need to call other staff or the police. And we've done that successfully in many cases, and because no demand is placed on the individual who's becoming angry or agitated, that person tends to calm down more quickly. So again, we can use our hearing. I often, when I teach this in class, give students a case example in which an individual goes into their room, slams the door, and begins smashing their possessions. And I ask the question in this case study, should staff people go into the room? The answer to that question is no. There's no circumstance where I can imagine staff people safely going into that room. Think about it. If the person isn't presenting a danger, they've already communicated by virtue of their own behavior that they want to be left alone and that this is the best way for them to calm down. So we shouldn't go in. And if the person's behavior escalates, well, it becomes dangerous for us to go in. Because if they're smashing things and doing things that could potentially harm themselves, then they're definitely a threat to us. And maintaining our safety as a priority is extremely extremely important. And I want to remind you that dead people rarely are effective on their jobs. So when an individual goes into that space and they're causing potential damage in there, use your ears to observe. If you hear things like breaking mirrors and breaking windows, this becomes a situation where you want to call the police. If you hear that a person's making a huge mess in their room or smashing their possessions, we need to get perspective. This can be alarming to us. It's definitely outside the norm of what most of us deal with daily. However, on its own, it doesn't constitute a significant threat at this point. And it's a situation where I might likely want to just keep my resources at bay until I actually am sure I'm going to need them. If a person has smashed up their possessions, well, that's a circumstance that can be a very educational process when the person is later on calmed down. It's an illusion that you're going to go into that room and be able to bring that to a safe, calm resolution anyways if you are a person working in a community-based facility or if you're a family member. So we need to keep ourselves safe and live to work another day. So continuing that crisis phase, do not attempt to talk, reason, or comfort that person. If any verbal interaction is needed at all, we're going to keep it simple, monotone, and brief. And one of the ways that we do that is to consider talking to other people instead of to the subject. So as I said, most of the time I say absolutely nothing to that person. But occasionally I want to contextualize behavior for that person very simply. So what I might do is say something like this. Hey everybody, I can see that Mike needs some time by himself. Let's all go into the craft room and have some time there, and we'll come out when Mike's feeling better. I kept it short. I didn't tell it to Mike himself, but now Mike knows that when I'm leaving the room, I'm not leaving the room to call the police. I'm not leaving the room because I'm angry at him, and therefore I'm not aggravating him further. If I left the room non-verbally in that circumstance, it's amazing how often Mike would now be knocking on my door and trying to get through because he wants to basically make me pay for abandoning him. So if you do think, based on your knowledge of the client, that it's important for that person to have a small amount of context, keep it very simple, keep it in that businesslike and monotone voice, and try telling it to other people in the surrounding instead of to that individual. Remember that this person needs time. That's the single most important ingredient. And your personal clock is not the same as theirs. We can guarantee that. And often people go and re-intervene because they think to themselves, surely that must have been enough time. Just because it would have been enough time for you does not mean it's going to be enough time for this individual. We only make the decision to intervene based on our observation of that person's behavior. And we're going to talk more about that as we get into stages 4 and 5 in a moment. But we've already talked about the behaviors that we're looking for in stage 5 that tell us it's okay to reintroduce things. Don't forget to get help and be clear with the help as to what you want. Do you want them to simply be there in case things worsen? Do you want them to manage other people in the environment? Do you want them to keep the crowd at bay? Do you want them to telephone emergency responders? Those sorts of things. Do you want them to get medication? Do you want them to take the lead because they know the individual better? But we don't just say help. Now, one of the things that I like to do is use a word that is a code word. And this word should be a word that on its own does not cause alarm. For example, a word I often recommend is party, because it simply means I need a number of people, I need more people here. But it's not a word that makes people get alarmed. You can use any word that you want, and that's a simple, quick response that people might hear in the home or in the facility or in the community, knowing that they need to come to you as a first priority and then find out what you need. If you need to call 911, then this is the time when you're going to do that as well. And there are things that you can do that 911 can't, and vice versa. So you need to make sure that you're calling them because you need the powers of the RCMP or the police department in your community, or because you need people who are emergency medical responders. So it's not a scenario where we're just calling because we're scared. We want to know it, and when they get there, we need to let them know what it is we're hoping they can do for us and for that individual. Remember to maintain these priorities. As I said, dead people are usually not very effective at their jobs. You will not be able to help a person if you've allowed yourself to get injured. So you put your own priority above the individual and even above bystanders. That's your first priority, so that you can be around to continue to work. The second priority, if you have to choose, is to make sure that innocent parties and bystanders, including other consumers or clientele, are protected. And then, as a third priority, if you're able to help that individual, we do that. Recognize that there will be times when you cannot intervene to help that individual and maintain your first priority. For example, I've worked with people who are bigger than me, stronger than me, and more skilled as aggressors than I was. And I simply was not able to intervene until either another staff person was on scene or until the RCMP or Vancouver Police arrived. And that was difficult because there were times I had to stand by while I knew a person was doing significant harm to themselves or even doing things potentially to other people, and I had to wait at least a few moments until there was a way for me to safely intervene. I cannot just charge in and be a hero. That's not what my job is, and it's more likely that I'm going to cause more harm to myself and others if I walk in without a strategy. Your safety is paramount. The cool down phase is our fourth phase. So remember, this is all about what we don't do. And in essence, it's easiest to say that we simply continue what we were doing in the crisis phase. Do not reintroduce the upsetting stimulus, even if you can tell the person is calmer than they were. We're not looking for calming. Remember, we're looking for calm, and they're not the same. Do not implement consequences. Do not try to teach or engage in an in-depth conversation with the individual about the issue. If they engage you in conversation, limit your response to a simple response that is in keeping with what they've asked you. Encourage and praise the person for their abilities and their efforts to regulate their emotions. A really simple thing that I say to people, and I don't say it a lot, I say it every minute or so, is, I can see that you are breathing more slowly. Good job of getting back on track. Or I can see that you are cleaning up. Good job of getting back on track. And the reason why I like that expression, good job of getting back on track, is it avoids a flag word that we talked about earlier of calm down. Calm. Some people have really become sensitized to that word. So I like the idea of helping people realize that they're returning back to sort of their normal life. It's not important that you use that specific expression, but that you find a way that you believe will work with that individual to help them realize you can see they're getting back to who they normally are, and that you want that to continue, that you're praising and reinforcing that. Continue reducing stimuli, as we said. Give the person time and space as they need, recognizing that for some people this can take days or even weeks. It's often critical to know the mental state of your client. Too often, staff people think that the person has resolved their agitation when they're actually still aroused. So as we said, distinguish between the calming person and the calm person. It's better to err on the side of caution and not engage that person until the individual initiates that discussion of the original issue. It's probably the most simple and conservative way to make sure that you're actually in stage 5, which is where we're going next. So stage 5, recall, is the resolution phase. Now the person is calm or even potentially mildly depressed in terms of their energy and agitation, and perhaps a bit more focused on the issue, cognitively speaking. So the person may do things in this stage like, for example, trying to fix the situation or make amends. They might apologize, for example. People often wonder, should I accept that apology? The answer is yes, you should. That doesn't mean that you're telling the person that you don't have an issue with their behavior or that you won't be doing things to deal with it. But allow the person to mend whatever they've done. Pick up the mess, say their apologies, try and get back on track. Don't force apologies on people during this stage. And there are two main reasons for this. First of all, when people have apologies forced on them, they really learn to just manipulate that system. They learn to just apologize as a matter of course. And second of all, they don't really learn the meaning of an apology. They don't ever actually come back and stop and gain insight. If you think about it, apologies are not just saying you're sorry. They're actually a bit of a promise that we're going to try and improve the next time. And that's what we really want to focus with that person on. How can we improve for the next time? Now, I also get asked all the time, can I put a consequence on this person? We worry way too much about consequences in social services. And the truth is that the research is very, very clear that people respond far more to being reinforced and rewarded for making behavioral choices that are functional than they do for being punished for things that are dysfunctional, things that aren't very effective behaviors. And the reason? Well, there's a lot of them, but one of the main reasons is that when we tell people they did something bad and make them clear for them with a consequence, it doesn't illustrate for them what they should do instead. Another reason why consequences aren't very effective for some people, especially punishments, is that they make the person feel distant and distrustful of the authority figures in their life. And we can't really do anything with a person if we do not maintain some form of relationship with that person. Now, all of that being said, consequences are possible, and we are going to allow what we call natural or logical consequences to occur, but we're not going to allow punishments to occur. And so we're going to have to give you a bit of a crash course right now in how to distinguish between those things. Natural consequences are consequences that occur without the input of an extra party. They happen as a natural matter of course. Now, for example, if I play with matches, I might get burned. Or if I leave a stove on the pot, or sorry, a pot on the stove, I might burn my food. Now, the thing about those natural consequences is that you can see they don't always happen. People can play with matches many times without getting burned. Or they could be very harsh consequences. A person could get burned very badly, which would make it obviously not an appropriate consequence. So relying on natural consequences can be challenging, can sometimes be an ineffective approach. But if there seems to be a natural consequence in your circumstance, such as the person smashed one of their favorite possessions and therefore they don't have that possession anymore, or the person was agitated so much that they missed an outing they normally enjoy, that's natural. And that's where we want to let that take place. Another example of a natural consequence is the person scared somebody else and that person has been reluctant to engage with them. So we can help that person to understand why that's a natural response to their aggressive or angry behavior. Logical consequences do require the input of another party. They don't happen automatically. However, as the name suggests, they are logically connected to what happened. Logically means they make sense in the context of what happened. A classic example of this is a person is playing baseball in the backyard and smashes a window, and they're told that they're not allowed to play baseball in the backyard anymore. There's a clear connection between why that behavior is not allowed and the behavior that happened before. Or a person smashes somebody else's possessions during a fit of pique, and they're told that they need to replace it, and they have to spend their savings to do that. Again, that's logical. So logical consequences should make sense not only to the person applying them, but to the person to whom they're being applied. They have to make sense in that context. And they're probably the more beneficial of the two types of consequences because you have some management or control over them. You should not go well out of your way to try and create some form of logical connection. Because again, if the person doesn't see the connection, then it's going to be a hollow distinction. The third type of consequence, and the one that we do not use, and if you're a professional taking this course, not only should you not use it, it's because it's not effective, but it's also highly unethical, is punishment. Now, I need to be clear about this. Police officers and court officials use punishment. That's part of what their whole job involves. But community social service professionals and healthcare providers are not allowed to use punishment. Neither are educators. We should not be, for example, doing things like forcing people to write lines or get spankings because of their behavior. So what is a punishment? It's not just corporal punishment. Many people assume it's only punishment when it involves a person being treated with pain, and that's not correct. That's called an aversive response. But punishment simply means any arbitrary consequence that is put in place by a person with power to a person with less power. So an arbitrary consequence is a consequence that is not naturally connected or logically connected to the behavior. And it only has its weight or power because of that power differential between the person applying it and the person receiving it. So for example, when a parent tells a child that they're grounded because they didn't do their homework, this is actually punishment. And it's ethical for parents to use punishment because they're not professionals. Whether it's highly effective is a different story. But when we tell somebody they're grounded for a week or two because they didn't do their homework, as much as it might be a common response within a household, it is not a logical or natural consequence because homework has nothing to do with being forced to stay home. And neither does the idea of it being set for a week or 2 weeks or something like that. So it's really important for us to make that connection. What could I do that would take that punishment and turn it into a consequence? Well, I could tell a child that they are grounded until they've caught up on their schoolwork. Now that makes a logical consequence out of what was before a punishment. They have the ability to shorten or lengthen the amount of time that they're forced to stay home by responding to the problem behavior. Now, one more word about this. Many people make the mistake of thinking that because something is common, it must be logical or natural. The most common one that I ask my students about is getting a speeding ticket. I ask the question, is a speeding ticket a punishment or a consequence? The answer is that it's a punishment, not a consequence. And people are often surprised to hear that. Well, it's a punishment because it is only put in place. The only reason that you pay a speeding ticket is because somebody in authority made you do it. The fact that you were charged $175 or whatever amount of dollars for driving 30 kilometers over the speed limit is really an arbitrary distinction. It could have been $500 for driving 20 kilometers. It could have been any amount of money for any type of speed. So it's common to have this happen, and it's quite ethical for police officers to do that in our system, but it doesn't mean that it would be an effective thing for us to do as community responders. So how could we turn that one into a logical consequence? Well, for example, we could say to somebody, you were caught speeding, so as a result, you have to go to a course on safe driving. And that course costs $175. Or every year in the community of Mission, there are 500 speeders. And in order to deal with those 500 speeders, we have to hire a police officer. So we're going to divide the salary of that person by 500. And you're going to pay the portion of that traffic control officer as a result of your speeding. So that makes a little bit more sense. There's a connection between what you've paid and why you've paid it. So consequences, that's a long description, especially for something I'm saying should probably not be the biggest area of focus for you anyways. But if you are going to apply consequences, make sure that they are natural or logical. Debriefing is another thing we want to do during the stage. Debriefing simply means discussing what happened with the person, both to kind of achieve some clarity around it, but mostly to review it for the future so that the person can really navigate, negotiate new responses for the future. We want to make sure that we don't inadvertently or accidentally reinforce that person's highly escalated behavior by having this discussion be a really elaborate, lengthy, therapeutic session. I have a basic rule with the people I've supported over the years. If, as a result of stage 1 arousal or stage 2 arousal, the person is able to calm themselves down and have a conversation with me, they're going to find that that conversation is much more person-centered, much more emotionally supportive, and it's really going to not be limited in terms of what I'm prepared to do with that person in terms of the amount of time or support that I show them. But one of the concrete and simple messages that I convey to my clients when they've achieved level 3 is afterwards I'll say to them, when you did blank, when you hit John or when you threw the potted plant, I had to stop thinking about you first and start thinking about me and John first. And I want the client to really understand that that's a pivotal point. And when they've done that behavior, when they've crossed that pivotal point, the conversations that I have with them are far more business-like. They're more about what could we do next time, which is what we're going to talk about next. We're going to use what we call an educational correction for a person who has gone through stage 5 or is in stage 5. So what's an educational correction? Well, an educational correction is a fairly simple statement that has 3 aspects to it. The first aspect is the words next time. That's literally what I want you to start it with. And the second aspect is describing what the person should do next time, what behavior we hope they'll do that's functional and desired. And the third aspect is what they'll get as a result of that. What positive reinforcement will occur to them as a result of that. And often that positive reinforcement is very natural. It's not something that we add in, although it could be. It'll just be something that goes better in their life. So for example, a statement like this might occur. Next time, Mike, if you use your words to tell me what you're upset with, we'll be able to get right back on track and still go to the movies. Or next time, Susan, if you come and see me before you raise your hand to John, I'll be able to help you work out your problem and everybody will stay friends. So those are simple examples of telling the person in a nice, concise way what's expected of them next time. Here's some variations that people do that tend to not work. The first thing that they normally do is describe things in terms of negative. So, Johnny, you today are not going to get to the movie because you didn't handle yourself without hitting. Notice that this is not talking about next time. It's very negative, and it doesn't specify a behavior that we want to see, so it doesn't really prepare a person for the future, neither does it motivate that individual. Here's another variation that's even worse. Johnny, you didn't behave calmly today, so you're going to miss out on the movie. What's even more troubling than the last example is that the word calmly not only doesn't describe what we want the person to do, but it doesn't even describe specifically what the behavior was that was problematic. It's actually not a problem that Johnny wasn't calm. It was only a problem when Johnny raised his hand to somebody else. If Johnny had been agitated and angry, but still used words to resolve the issue, we could have solved the problem for him, or come and got his medication, or taken a rest, or any number of other responses. So this is why we want to really be focused on the concrete, and why we want to be focused on the next time. So once again, that educational correction is a very simple statement. It's next time, if you do blank, you will get blank. And make note of that and use it. It's very clear to me in the time that I've worked in this field that a number of very simple responses work time and again. We often think that human communication needs to be extremely elaborate, but I don't believe that. The same way as you will reach into your toolbox and have your favorite tools because they work each time, these are examples of those working in a social milieu. And this is a statement that works for me time and again. We also, as we said, want to praise progress, but this is a little different than the progress we praised in level 4. And this is going to seem odd to some of you. I want you to think about a case that I dealt with a few years ago. The very first time this individual became very agitated, and it was a woman, she yelled, she swore, she threw herself on the ground, she picked up an object and threw it at people, and then when the people went to an area of refuge, she went to the door and started pounding on the door. She then went outside and assaulted a stranger because she was still agitated. The next time that I dealt with her, she did all of those things except go outside and assault a stranger. Now, as strange as it might seem, that represented significant progress. And I can tell you the strangers were very happy about that. The third time that we dealt with this situation, the person threw down their object, yelled, swore, sat on the floor, and did not go and hit on the office door and did not go and assault a stranger. Again, we had more progress. The next time the person became agitated, they threw a softer object, this time a purse, on the floor, and instead of saying a swear word, they yelled, "Leave me alone," and again they sat on the floor. And you can see that this person is progressing, as strange as it might seem, because all the way along we've been describing behaviors that would be scary and alarming and not terribly socially appropriate, but they are progressively better each time. And we finally got to the point that after the 5th or 6th of these interventions, the person actually went to another room, yelled at people that she wanted to be left alone, and did nothing that was physically aggressive at all. And when she got to that point, she was managing far, far more effectively. And that backlash or consequences of her behavior were far less. So this meant that she had fewer reasons to become re-agitated, and we started to notice another type of progress, which was simply the amount of days between her outbursts gradually got bigger and bigger and bigger. And to the point where this person, when people worked with her, it was surprising for these staff to come along and find out by reviewing her case file that she had once been a very aggressive person to support. So, really important for us to identify how a person's behavior has improved, if it has, from the previous occasions, even if there was still challenging behavior. Look for the positive thing that the person did and identify it as a behavior and praise them for it. Navigate and negotiate new responses for the next time that would reflect even more progress. Keep them simple, keep them manageable, and then if it happens again, repeat this process. And lastly, we want that person to return as much as they can to their normal routine, both socially and in terms of their activities. Get them back into the swing of doing what they normally do. Sometimes we need to have a strategy, both talking to the individual as well as talking to other people who are supporting that individual and finding out what their comfort level with this is. For example, we're not going to throw family members or staff people or friends right back into the fray with that person if they're not comfortable with that. That's one of those logical consequences we want that individual to understand, that when they've used behavior that's frightening or threatening, other people are sometimes going to be cautious in reintroducing the routines. It's also important for us to be manageable and reasonable in terms of what we expect of that person that day. So I'm sometimes asked by people, well, what do I do if I've had an outburst with an individual at 3 or 4 o'clock and they're supposed to be going out into the community that evening to a movie or to dinner? Is it a reasonable thing for us to reschedule that evening? And I say that is the perfect way to phrase that. We're not going to just cancel or put off that outing in some indistinct way. It's a logical consequence for that person, and we want to be really clear with them about when we are going to do it and why it has been postponed. But we need to make that decision based on the individual as well, because in some cases we know that will actually re-escalate that person. And sometimes people want to say, well, we're not going to that activity because it's a punishment or consequence. And we've already dealt with that. We're not looking for ways to make people pay. Being agitated and aroused is already a very traumatic experience, not only for the people around that individual, but for the individual themselves. It throws them off, it's emotionally and physically very disturbing and draining, and it makes people worry about the relationships. So you really don't need to think hard about finding extra consequences for people. If you think about it, normally after you've been upset, you feel not very well afterwards, emotionally and physically. It's not something that you want to repeat. And people we're supporting are in the same category most of the time.